Paul Robert Coyle, so a TV series writer. He wrote Star Trek, Hercules, Xena, many more shows. That's just to name the few. He also has just put out a new book, and well, I'll definitely put this in the description box, Paul. It is Sword, Starship, and also superheroes. So sword, starships, and superheroes. I'm getting tongue-tied just saying that myself, Paul, but thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate your time today.
Oh, well, thanks, Robin. It's great to hear that you're a fellow LaSalle graduate. Yeah, a few years after me, but yeah, and I talk about LaSalle in the book. This is a Catholic high school in Providence, Rhode Island, and I went there for 4 years, and they just published an interview with me in the alumni magazine, as a matter of fact. So
I hear all the time, whether it's, through people I know, that they want to be singers, they want to be actors, they want to work in TV in some way, shape, or form. And they go to LA, and it's one of the toughest jobs to get. Is any of those jobs in TV or anything entertainment in general. So talk about some of those setbacks or obstacles, because like you said, you faced quite a few, and anybody that wants to be in this field is going to get those obstacles and setbacks.
Yes, and mine were, and I write about them in the book. Some of them were very embarrassing at the time. And but I moved on, and I never wanted to think about those failures again. But now, years later, you can write about them, and other people can learn lessons from them.
Sure.
For instance, so as I say, I took Dorothy Fontana's writing class, and this was 1970 to 71 or so. And about that time, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, started developing the animated Star Trek, an animated cartoon version of that original series to keep the franchise alive. And Dorothy was involved in that. And somehow I got an assignment. She invited me to pitch stories along with other professional freelance writers. And I did, and I got one. I got one that was approved by Gene. And so Dorothy and I worked on the story, but I wrote it, and I had a contract. This was a professional assignment. This was a year into my coming to Los Angeles, so I was ecstatic, right? And the bottom line is that the bottom fell out of that. I did get paid for it, but then Gene Roddenberry changed his mind about doing it, so they shelved it and cut it. But in the meantime, I had been told not to do any work on it until I got notes or got a go-ahead. This was after I turned in the outline. And weeks and even a few months went by. And class had ended, so we're in the summer now. So I wasn't in touch with Dorothy every week anymore. Right. So I got antsy, and I went ahead and I wrote the script on my own, and I sent it in. And next thing, I got a very formal letter saying that they were refusing to pay for it because it was an unauthorized spec script, blah, blah, blah. So I was devastated. I was humiliated, right? As I say, I'd been paid for the story, but they weren't going to pay me for the script with a larger amount of money. So that was devastating because I told all my friends and family back east that I had this, I was writing this episode of this brand new Star Trek series. Turns out in the second season, after Gene and Dorothy had left the show, whoever at that company took the project over, pulled that script off the shelf and assigned it to another writer, and it did get made, with a lot of differences, but still my name was not associated with it. I didn't even know that for years after, because I never watched the show because of the experience was so devastating to me at the time. So that was a big setback. Around the same, shortly after that, I got an internship through the teachers at LA City College. They submitted to me to the Television Academy, the Emmy Award people, for an internship on the show Mod Squad, which was a hit detective show at the time that I loved. And that didn't turn out so well either, because I didn't have social skills. Somehow coming to Los Angeles and being thrown into a professional environment, I decided to put some notes on the producer's desk and my thoughts on some of the scripts that they were working on. And he didn't appreciate that. And I shouldn't have done it anyway. It was none of my business to tell the producer how I thought he should be writing his scripts, but I was too taken with myself. So that was another example of an experience that, I learned a ton in that internship just by being able to sit in on meetings and go to the set and But nevertheless, it was a humiliating, embarrassing experience. So
Hmm.
after accumulating half a dozen or so of these embarrassing experiences, I finally sold a script and haven't looked back since. The first script was to the show Streets of San Francisco, which, as I say, was a spec script that I wrote on my own. I had a night job as a security guard. At that point, college had ended. So I had a night job where I was able to write all night long in the guard shack at a movie studio, as it turns out. So it was a terrific job. I had the whole studio to myself from midnight to 8 a.m.
Wow.
And I churned out scripts, and I got an agent who was willing to submit them. And the people at that show, Streets of San Francisco, read it, and they bought it and shot it like a week later. And I haven't looked back ever since. It sounds easy, but understand it took me 5 years in Los Angeles to get to that point.
I mean, it just sounds like quite an experience to leave Rhode Island, smallest state in the Union, go to California, one of the biggest states in the Union, especially Los Angeles, one of the biggest cities in the country, and just from college as a 20-year-old and only 5 years, and you start producing scripts for TV shows. It's just incredible.
Well, yes, and look, another graduate from my LaSalle class, 1970, John Rourke, became a very successful comedian. And
I interviewed John.
We didn't know each other that well. We were in the same classes, but we didn't hang out together. But I remember him as being the kind of class cut up who was always doing impressions of the teachers, of the brothers, And so he followed a career to become a stand-up comic and an impressionist, and was in movies like The Naked Gun with Leslie Nielsen. And so John did very well for himself. He came out to Los Angeles after I did. He stuck around, worked in Boston and so forth. And a few other members, one other member of our class, John Galugli, came to LA as an actor and now runs the theater company in North Hollywood. So I'm not the only LaSalle graduate who ended up from that class of 1970, but I was the first. I came direct. I didn't want to waste any time. I said, if I stick around Providence, I'll end up on the fire department, and I'll never get it. Now's my chance. So I really think between high school and college is a big opportunity for people. If you're going to make a move, I think that's the time to make it. And look, it was easier then financially. Right. I came out, I got a room in the house for $13 a week rent. You can't do that anymore. So pressure's on kids nowadays, but I still suggest if you want to do something, follow your heart when the time is right. Yeah.
I'm Paul Coy here. I'm Fire Breathing Rob. Paul, I want to speak about this. We look into a lot of the TV shows that you've worked on. A lot of it's fantasy. Did you always have that fascination for fantasy? Because I know you spoke about the cartoon, Marvel and all that stuff growing up. But did you always have that fascination with fantasy, and that's why you wanted to work in that specific genre?
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, of course. But I think a lot of kids my age, loved Superman and so forth. But most of them grew out of it. I kind of never did. And then I had that early flirtation with Star Trek. All right. But then after that, after I started, as I say, the Streets of San Francisco was my first sale, and then I went on to write proper assignments, for shows like Barnaby Jones and Chips, cop and detective shows of the period, and then later Simon and Simon, a detective show. So for years I veered in that direction, and then eventually with the Star Trek Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, I found my way back to sci-fi and fantasy, and I followed that path, and that led to Hercules and Xena, where I was on staff as both a writer and a producer. So I was heavily involved in those shows, not just in the episodes I wrote, but those that were being written by freelance writers and other staff writers. So the answer is yes. I started out with a heavy interest in sci-fi and fantasy, and then veered off toward other shows which are popular at the time, police and detective shows, mostly as a freelance writer, but sometimes on staff at a show called Crazy Like a Fox, starring Jack Warden, which was a comedy drama detective show, and then back to sci-fi fantasy. Everybody follows their own path, but you have to be flexible, in the business. What often happens is you do a show for a certain producer, and you do a good job, and the producer wants to use you again, and then that producer moves on to another show. That's what happened with Star Trek. I first worked with Mike Piller, who was a story editor on Simon & Simon, a detective show. A few years go by, he suddenly moves to Star Trek Next Gen and calls me in. So would you be interested in doing this show? Because I think your sensibilities suit me over here. That's what led, in an odd way, that, working for that detective show led directly to Star Trek. So you're going to need to be flexible. A producer, you don't know what show the producer is going to be on next year, and they might call you in to do that show. So that's the way any television writer's career goes. In those days, it was easier to make a living as a freelance writer, going from show to show. Nowadays, everything is staff written, so you're either on staff or you're out in the cold. Right. But shows are still being written, more shows than ever with all these cable shows. Yeah.
Paul, I want to talk about this, and then I do want to get into the book. But a couple more things before we get into the book. You've been working in Hollywood for quite a while. How has it changed since you started in Hollywood? To me, and I'm only 31 years old, but since I've been watching TV and even movies, it seems like the movies, especially, they just put out like, for instance, an older movie, but they do it now with Transformers. They put out Transformers 1, 2, and 3, Jaws 1, 2, and 3. I know that's an older one, but it just seems like there's not a lot of, as far as people writing, they just don't have a lot of depth now. They just want to keep repeating the same idea, using the same kind of characters, and just repeat the show and just keep it running. Do you agree with that? Do you feel like Hollywood has kind of lost a little bit of its creativity in some aspects, whether it's in movies like I talked about, or also in TV shows too?
Yeah, it's across the board. I mean, we talk about movies and sequels. That's been being done for years. You can't blame a studio really for wanting to make money on something. And if the original version of that was a success, then they're going to want to do 2 and 3 and 4. Yeah, that's understandable. They rarely live up to. Sometimes they're as good, and people say The Godfather 2 was as good, if not better, than the first. But so even there were sequels to Godfather, right? Made by Coppola, the original guy. In television, it's the same thing. If something works, you're going to clone it. Every CBS show now is the same as every other CBS show. It's a police procedural. It started with CSI or NCIS, and it goes on and on. Basically, all shows have the same format. But look, there's still original. This year, and as far as movies go, because of the pandemic, there were fewer movies released at all, and the studios held back their big blockbusters like Wonder Woman 1984. So all you got were the indies, what they call the independent movies for the most part, some of which were terrific, right? They're all up for awards now, but the general public hasn't seen them because they weren't in theaters. They went to streaming, or I mean, the big tentpole movies were held back, or few were released, and only the indies were put out. But there's a lot of originality within those indies, I'd say. Promising Young Woman. These don't fit a pattern, and none of them were sequels that I can think of. And in television, yes, everything's a sequel in the sense that everything feels like the show that came before it. NCIS is now spinning off NCIS Hawaii. This goes on until they use up.
But do you feel like, Paul, that Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Netflix is going to put pressure on these big networks like CBS, ABC, and NBC to make a better product? Otherwise, people are just going to end up, and they've already gone away from cable in the droves and just watch streaming stuff.
Yeah, as far as putting pressure on the networks, I don't know. I think the networks still have the monopoly on that. It's free TV. They have commercials, of course, but people have to pay for cable. So there's really a smaller market in cable, and the shows themselves produce fewer episodes. Network shows can still produce 25 episodes a year of a given show. Cable, and on cable or streaming, what do you make? 8, 9, or 10 episodes max, and you call that a season? It's tough to make a living on that show as a writer. And even if you're on staff as a writer on those shows, you're only working 6 months out of the year. And then I'm in a network show, you're working year round. On shows like Hercules and Xena, we were not network, but we were syndicated. We ran on network stations, and we produced 22 to 25 episodes a year. So it was a year-round thing. Nowadays, you're on staff at a show, and you're working via Zoom this year. But the entire season for a writer begins and ends in 6 months, if that. And you maybe get to write one script during that period, because there are so many writers on staff. You can only do one each. So the business, the behind the scenes nature of the business has changed heavily. As far as the movies and the shows themselves go, yes, there's always a similarity. There's always a trend toward doing sequels. If something worked, let's do it again, or let's clone it and do another version of it. And I think there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I mean, I see all kinds of movies. When theaters are open, I do. But yeah, I mean, I love the big studio movies as much as the indies. You want to mix. Yeah. Sure. So the answer is the business has changed drastically, but people still make a living at it.
Can you tell the viewers of what kind of thought process goes into the scripts? Do you talk to the producer first, and you guys kind of make sure you guys have I guess I should say even before that, do you start off and make sure that you've worked with that producer before, or if you're working with that producer in a new realm, say, hey, are we going to have the same ideas? Because obviously, if you guys don't have the same philosophy on what's going to go into the script, it's not going to work out. So how does the script writing go as far as a TV show?
All right, well, let me tell you how it always works. It's always worked, and it still works now. Now, in the older days, freelance writers would be invited in to write these shows. Nowadays, it's the staff. They have people signed for the season, and contractually, they're each going to write one. But whether you're freelance or staff, it begins basically the same. You, as the writer, come up with ideas. You come up with 5 or 6 ideas, and you went and you meet with the producer and you pitch those stories verbally. All right, like this, I'd like to do an episode about such and such. All right. And the producer hears his pitch, and then he either shoots them all down, or oh, we've already done something like that, or we're already doing something too close to that, which you're unaware of, or well, that might be interesting. Let me think about that. So it starts with a verbal pitch, whether you're on staff or you're an outside freelance writer. And then you go home, or then you go away, and then you wait for the producer to call you back. And sometimes you never hear back from them because the story went nowhere. Look, you can have a great pitch in the room. You think everything went over great, and then you never hear back from them. Or you can fumble your way through a pitch and get nervous and tongue-tied and somehow get an assignment out of that, with me, it's been 50-50. But then all right, so let's say you get the call. They either call you or they call your agent, and all right, now you have an assignment. Now come back Tuesday, and we'll talk it through. So you do that. Now you go in and you're concentrating on the one story area that they're already interested in. You come in with a beginning, middle, and end, and the story beats. Or in television, everything's a 4-act structure with commercial breaks. Maybe not that way anymore with cable shows, but still you think in terms of an hour's story with certain high breaks, little mini cliffhangers every 15 minutes. All right, and then after you kick that story around, and it may be just you and the producer, or maybe with a table of 8 people, all of the staff writers may get involved. Then you go away and you write an outline, or more typically today, what's called a story break session, where you're in the room, and they do this even via Zoom now. You've got a blackboard up there, and you're putting the beats of the story down scene by scene in a room verbally, and then it's transformed into writing, but you're all pitching ideas back and forth as to this scene follows this scene, and you work your way through the 1-hour story that way. That's the way almost all television is done. It's not my preference. I prefer to take the thing home, work on it myself, work out those beats on my own, and then come back and get notes. But that's kind of the old-fashioned way. I'd be misleading people to say to expect that you're going to be given a lot of freedom to do that on your own. Nowadays, it's going to be a staff-written kind of situation. But you still ultimately go home, you write an outline, you bring it back, you get approval. Now at this point, one of several things might happen. They might not like your work, so they cut you off and they're going to assign the script to somebody else. Or they like your work. All right, the next step is to take our notes and either rewrite the outline or go to script. Once you get a pickup to go to script, you're going to get paid a lot more money now. And then now you go home and you write the script. You are on your own when you do that. You don't write the script in a room full of 8 people contributing to it. You go home and you sweat it out, and then you turn it in. And at that point, you either do a rewrite or they take it over and the producer rewrites it himself or herself. That's the structure. That's always been the way television's been written. It starts with a pitch, a verbal pitch. You come up with all of these story areas for a show. Not too many. They don't have a lot of time. And look, if they don't like the first 2 or 3 stories out of your mouth, chances are they're not going to really want to hear more. If they think if you're totally off track for their show, they're not going to want to sit and listen to 10 more stories, even if they're one-liners. I never pitch one-liners because, they sit there and say, interesting, then what happens? I always give it a lot of thought beforehand. So I do have a beginning, middle, and end to every story that I pitch. But you need to be flexible and change gears if they say, oh, I'd rather go in this direction. That's interesting, but I'd rather take it in this direction. So that's the short of it all is you pitch verbally. And that's a certain kind of technique that they don't teach. Nowadays they do, but writing courses never took into consideration that you have to verbally pitch a story. You have to be a salesman. You have to be an actor in a sense. You have to, or a stand-up comic, you have to kind of take command of the room and speak like I'm speaking now, right? And then shut up and let them give their feedback.
What were some of your favorite shows that you wrote for? And also, what was the interest? Did you have a big interest in a lot of those shows, or was it mainly, to go back to what you said previously, that the producer that you were working with said, hey, I like you, I want you in this production when we write this series? So what was it? Was it just you liked those shows, or was it the producer?
Well, it's half and half. I mean, Starting out, obviously, when I wrote that Streets of San Francisco on spec on my own, it's because I happened to like that show. But I was writing for a lot of shows on television at the time, Hawaii Five-0 or whatever. You write a script, you give it to the agent, and the agent submits it to the producer. So in that point, I'm not going to sit down and take weeks to write an episode of a show that I don't care about, that I don't watch myself, obviously. So you kind of you're drawn toward the shows that interest you as a viewer. So that's the answer there. And then after I sold that Streets, I did do a second episode for them on assignment, but the show itself was canceled before that second script got made. But the production company, Quinn Martin Productions, they had produced a lot of shows that I loved as a kid, like The Fugitive. They had other shows on the air besides Streets of San Francisco, one of which was Barnaby Jones, a detective show starring Buddy Ebsen. So I asked to have a pitch meeting over there, and I did, and that was my first official pitch, where it was, I've just described, I go in to meet with the producer and I verbally pitch stories, and I was striking out, and then the last idea that I had, he kind of sparked two about a scuba diving murder, and that became an assignment. So again, I liked that show. I was drawn to that show, and the entire production company and the writer-producers behind that show had done other shows that I respected and liked, so I loved working with these people. And now, a year or so later, a little bit established now, having written those shows I just talked about, my agent started sending me out to other shows, new shows that weren't on the air yet that I didn't know about, like Chips, for instance. I'd never heard of it because it wasn't on the air. They had a pilot. They were screening the pilot for potential writers. So he said, I put you on the list to go see the screening of the pilot, Tuesday afternoon at MGM. So I went there and I watched it. I thought it was terrible, by the way, but the producer came in to speak to the room afterwards, and any of you guys interested in pitching, call the office and make an appointment because we're desperate for stories. Oh, wow. All right, look, I walked out of that room, and a lot of those writers who were in the room that day weren't had no intention of calling because they didn't like the pilot. They just didn't go for it. I said, well, what have I got to lose? So I made the appointment. I came up with some ideas, and I, in fact, got an assignment on that show. There was another show at that same exact time called A Man from Atlantis, a sci-fi show starring Patrick Duffy. Right? You won't remember it because it ended after 13 weeks. But I saw that pilot. I really liked that. And I said, oh, I want to write for this show. And I got a pitch over there, and I did not get an assignment there. I got Chips instead. I mean, I could have gotten both at the same time, but I didn't. Well, luckily, Chips turned out to be the hit show that went on for years, and I made nice residuals off of that show. And the other one went nowhere and was canceled quickly, and nobody remembers it. So over the years, that's the answer is you're drawn to certain shows. You say, oh, can I get in on this show? Is there any way I can get in the door on this show? A lot of times you can't. They're not interested. Oh, they'll read your material. The producer will tell the agent, oh, send over a script or something. We'll read it. And they read it and they pass. You know, your work doesn't interest them. So it's 50-50. In other instances, as I mentioned with Mike Pillar, a guy from Simon & Simon, who's under Star Trek. He became hugely successful over there. So that led to my doing that show, which kind of in turn led to, in a roundabout way, to Hercules and Xena. Some other producer friends that I worked with over the years on Crazy Like a Fox recommended me to other producers. They recommended me to the producer of Xena, and I ended up, writing a bunch of those. So, however, I've never written for a show that I hated, or once you accept an assignment for something, you say, all right, now I'm going to give it 110%, right? Now I have to love the show when I'm writing it.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to take that attitude. If you're so cynical that you're only doing it for the money, you're not going to do a good job, I think. So you do the best. You pour everything into every script, whether sometimes you don't get along with the producer. Sometimes there's a personal situation where you're not sparked. The show may be great. You may love the show, but in the room with the people you're working with, I've had just a small number of instances where that happened. The two instances that I can think of. But I was freelance, so I wasn't there every day. It was a situation of I can't wait to be done with this thing and away from these people because they're driving me nuts, or they're so full of themselves. But luckily, I wasn't in a situation where I was dealing with those people every day.
Was the streets of San Francisco your favorite to write since was a good show of your favorite show of yours in general?
Well, it certainly was at the time. Yeah, it was a quality show that was filmed on location. I thought the look of it was great. Terrific actors, terrific guest stars. Yes, so the answer is yes. As far as my favorite, it may be my favorite, because it was the first. It got me started. They bought it and they shot it almost word for word the way I wrote it, but rarely word happens, right?
Right.
And then when it came to Hercules and Xena, as I say, I was more heavily involved, and we shot in New Zealand, and I got to go to New Zealand for one of my episodes. So in a sense, that particular episode is one of my favorites because I was there. And I mean, that's not going to translate to people watching it for themselves, but for me personally, I got to be there while that particular one was being shot. Yeah.
Paul Coyle here on Fire Breathing Rob. Paul, I want to talk about this as we go back into the book. What made you want to write the book?
Well, for years, I mean, I've had these stories and I've told people and I've spoken at writing. Sometimes I'd go back to LaSalle and speak to Brother Phillips' classes, film classes over the years. And I'd speak to classes at UCLA and I'd tell some of these anecdotes about how I started and so forth. And the kids seemed to be interested. Nevertheless, I never gave it really that much thought until about 2 or 3 years ago. I started reading a few books, started coming out by television writer or writer producers telling their anecdotes about working in the business. There's one by Nell Scoville, a woman writer who talked about being the only woman in the writer's room for the many years. Another writer producer that I worked with wrote a book, and I'm reading these and I'm thinking, I could do this. And the shows, a lot of the shows that I wrote for, specifically like Hercules, Xena, and Star Trek, have had and still have big cult followings.
Right.
And maybe I should. I don't want to say cash in on this, but I'm saying, I think there might be a market for a book of my stories. And I always love reading other people's stories, and specifically reading samples of scripts that are published within the books, and memos and behind the scenes stuff.
Right.
And I kept all of my scripts and memos, and I had huge piles of boxes of this stuff. So I'm thinking, oh, maybe I can finally put it to use. But I didn't want to sit down and write an entire book on spec. I know people have done that and gotten 50 rejections, right? So, I simply emailed one of the publishers of one of the books that I had read. Would you be interested in such and such a book from me? It turns out they recognized my name from I still had a little name value within the world of genre television, and they were very interested. And so that basically right off the bat, I had an assignment. I didn't need to shop it around. I mean, that is very rare in itself, I think. So I had serious interests, and then I sat down and wrote it. So it took a period of maybe a year to actually write it, to accumulate all the material, and then another year of both working with the editor and choosing the photos and the script pages. So the lawyers are always weighing in and saying, we can't publish this in its entirety or we'll be sued because Universal owns the rights, but we can print excerpts. So that's the way you work through a book of this sort, with full of script excerpts and memos. And I think I like reading this. As I say, I read these other people's works, and there haven't been a lot of books written about this, but so I thought, well, I've got a twofold market. I can get young people interested in writing careers to see, you know, what another writer went through and what it takes and what to expect. And secondarily, the fans of these shows that are always thirsty for behind the scenes stories. There are plenty of books written by actors about stuff that happens on the set. There hasn't been that much written over the years from the point of view of a freelance writer on these shows. So that's what I was hoping to accomplish, and I think I have. I've gotten some really complimentary reviews, and people who've read it seem to enjoy it. So that's how that came to be, and it's out now. Yeah.
Right. So Paul, where can people get the book as we end?
Well, Jacobs Brown Media Group is the name of the publishers, Jacobs Brown Publishing. Just go to their website, and I signed a bunch of copies over there. So everybody who orders one gets an autographed copy. And of course, it's available on Amazon. I don't think it's in brick or mortar stores because they've been going out of business, you know, thanks to the pandemic and even before that. Right. But Jacobs Brown Publishers is the main way for people to go and get it. Anybody who's interested in these shows, Hercules, Xena, Star Trek, or the police and detective shows, or potential writers, if you're interested in thinking about a writing career or just reading about somebody else's adventures, please do, and let me know. I love the feedback from people.
All right, Paul, thanks so much for your time. I greatly appreciate Paul Coyle. Definitely check out the book again, Swords, Starships, and Superheroes. Check it out again. So thanks so much again, Paul.
Thank you, Rob.